The violence visited upon Arthur Penhaligon occurred on a biting Tuesday in mid-January of 1962, inside a drafty warehouse near the Red Hook piers that smelled perpetually of wet rope and diesel fuel. Penhaligon was a small-time freight operator, a man whose only crime was attempting to secure a better future for his 3 trucks by switching his insurance coverage to a provider associated with Ellsworth Dock Vance. The decision should have been a routine business transaction, a simple calculation of profit and loss. But in the insulated world of the Brooklyn docks, economics were dictated by Vincent Torino's organization. 3 men entered Penhaligon's office after sunset, moving with the unhurried confidence of butchers entering a stockyard. They did not raise their voices or make grand threats. They simply locked the door behind them, a metallic click that signaled the end of Penhaligon's life as he had known it. The enforcer, known only as Carmine, led the interrogation, though the term implies a dialogue that never truly existed. Without preamble, he seized Penhaligon's right hand and flattened it against the heavy oak desk, where manifests and shipping routes were usually spread. The tool chosen was not a blade or a firearm, but a heavy-duty industrial staple gun, the kind used to secure canvas tarps over cargo on open decks. The first strike drove a steel fastener through the center of Penhaligon's palm, pinning the flesh to the wood grain with a wet, dull thud. The scream that tore from Penhaligon's throat echoed out onto the empty street, a sound later described by a night watchman in a sworn statement as something inhuman, like an animal caught in a machine. Carmine did not stop with the physical act. The psychological architecture of the threat required a specific target. He leaned in close, his voice a low rumble that competed with the victim's labored breathing, and explained that the next conversation would not be held with Penhaligon, but with his wife. The specificity of the threat, the mention of a woman who had never set foot on the docks, shattered whatever resistance the wounded man might have mustered. This was not merely a beating. It was a calculated disassembly of a man's safety perimeter. The message was clear. The margins of profit that Penhaligon sought were not worth the safety of his family. The enforcers left him there, weeping and nailed to his own desk, a gruesome monument to the price of defiance. By the following morning, the physical evidence of the assault had been documented in a police report that would eventually become a critical piece of federal evidence. Photographs taken at the Brooklyn Hospital emergency room showed a hand swollen to twice its normal size, the steel staple eventually requiring a surgeon's careful extraction. The official complaint named names, detailing the actions of Carmine and his associates with the precision of a man who knew his life depended on the record being straight. However, the report landed on the desk of a precinct captain whose mortgage payments were suspiciously low for a man on a civil servant's salary. Within hours, the paperwork was buried in a filing cabinet under miscellaneous grievances, ignored by the very system designed to protect citizens like Penhaligon. The attempt to bury the truth was a standard operational procedure for the organization running the waterfront, a method that had succeeded for decades. Yet, in this instance, the silence did not signify the end of the matter. It merely transferred the leverage from the local precinct to a more dangerous set of hands. Ellsworth Vance had eyes and ears in places the Italians never thought to look, and the news of the staple gun and the threat against the wife reached his office in Harlem before the blood on Penhaligon's desk had even dried. For Vance, the attack on the freight operator was not a tragedy to mourn, but a data point to exploit, a blatant admission of guilt that the organization had just handed to him, wrapped in fear and desperation. The transmission of intelligence came through Julius Big Earl Carter, a man whose physical presence filled doorways and whose loyalty to Vance was absolute. Carter arrived at the office above the grocery store on Lenox Avenue with a grim expression, relaying the details of the assault and Penhaligon's subsequent capitulation. He expected an immediate, violent response. The old rules of the street dictated that blood must answer blood, that an attack on an associate required a reprisal against the attacker. Carter's hand had instinctively brushed against the weapon beneath his jacket as he spoke, his body tensed for the order to mobilize a crew and head south to the waterfront under the cover of darkness. Vance, however, offered no such mobilization order. He sat behind a heavy oak desk, his face a mask of stillness that revealed none of the rage that Carter anticipated. Instead of reaching for a phone to call for backup or weapons, Vance opened a bottom drawer and withdrew a manila folder that was already thick with papers, photographs, and typed notes. This was not a spur-of-the-moment reaction, but a continuation of a process that had begun months earlier. The attack on Penhaligon was simply another brick in a wall Vance was building, a wall that would eventually become a cage for the men who thought violence was their birthright. The strategy Vance employed was one of patient accumulation rather than immediate discharge. He instructed Carter to send a message to the injured Penhaligon, not with threats, but with an offer of protection for his wife and a request for documentation. The police report, the hospital photographs, the sworn statement, all of it was to be copied and delivered. Vance understood that while the local police were compromised, the federal authorities operated under a different set of constraints and ambitions. The evidence of assault and extortion was a currency that spent well in the offices of the United States Attorney, provided one had the patience to collect enough of it to force a transaction. To the average street operator, gathering paperwork while an enemy humiliated your associates looked like weakness, a failure of nerve that invited further aggression. But Vance possessed a temporal perspective that few in his position maintained. He played a game measured in years, not weeks. He viewed every insult, every act of intimidation, and every misstep by the opposition as a resource to be mined and refined. The assault on Penhaligon was worth potentially 5 years in a federal penitentiary, provided the evidence could be preserved and presented in the right forum. Vance was not ignoring the violence. He was filing it away for future use. This philosophy of delayed consequence was the bedrock of his operation. He saw the waterfront not as a territory to be conquered through force of arms, but as a crime scene waiting to be processed. The men who currently controlled it believed that their power lay in their ability to inflict pain, but Vance knew that true power lay in the ability to document that pain and hand it to men with badges and subpoenas. He was building a case file that would one day outweigh the influence of any judge or politician the organization had in its pocket. The war had already begun, but it was being fought with ledgers and lenses, not with revolvers and knives. The deposition of Arthur Penhaligon's ordeal into the growing file marked Moretti and Vance, represented a pivotal shift in the conflict's trajectory. Vance did not merely file the police report and hospital records, he cross-referenced them with known shipment schedules and the personnel logs of the dock workers' union. The assault was not an isolated incident of brutality, but a structural component of the extortion racket, a mechanism to enforce compliance and punish deviation. By treating the attack on Penhaligon as a legal data point rather than a personal affront, Vance stripped it of its emotional weight and transformed it into a weapon he could wield with precision. This was the essence of his method, converting the raw material of violence into the refined product of evidence. For weeks, the silence from Harlem was interpreted by the opposition as a retreat, a confirmation that the message had been received and understood. They could not have known that Vance was operating under a different timeline, one that extended far beyond the immediate news cycle of the streets. His strategy required the accumulation of pattern and frequency, a mosaic of incidents that would reveal the ongoing nature of the criminal enterprise to a federal prosecutor. A single assault was a local crime. A documented series of coordinated attacks, extortion attempts, and rigged contracts was a violation of the RICO Act, carrying penalties that could dismantle an entire hierarchy. The organizational discipline required to maintain this passive stance was immense, particularly for a man of Vance's standing in the community. In Harlem, reputations were built on the ability to respond instantly to disrespect, to project an aura of invulnerability that discouraged challenges. By absorbing the humiliation of his associate's injury without a visible counterstrike, Vance risked appearing weak in the eyes of both his rivals and his own constituents. Yet, he understood that the appearance of weakness was itself a tactical advantage, a lure that would encourage his enemies to become careless in their assumptions. He was trading his pride for their freedom, a transaction he intended to collect in full. The collection of evidence required a network of informants willing to risk their lives for the promise of future safety or financial reward. Vance had spent years cultivating these sources, not through fear, but through a reputation for honoring his word. Men like the night watchman who heard Penhaligon's screams, the nurse who treated the wound, and the clerk who processed the buried police report. All were small gears in a machine Vance was constructing. They provided the corroboration that would transform hearsay into admissible evidence. Each piece of paper, each whispered testimony, was another lock on the door of the cage he was methodically assembling. To maintain this operation, Vance relied heavily on his inner circle, men who had learned to trust his judgment, even when it contradicted their instincts. Big Earl Carter, despite his initial desire for immediate retribution, became the conduit for these sensitive communications. He moved through the city with the assurance of a man who knew he was protected by something more formidable than muscle. He was protected by a plan. The streets talked of war and turf, of boundaries drawn in blood, but the conversations in the back rooms of Harlem were of statutes and jurisdictions, of legal precedents that would soon come to bear on men who had never read a law book in their lives. The financial implications of the conflict were also being calculated with forensic precision. Vance's insurance initiative had been designed to undercut the entrenched syndicates by offering rates that were 40% lower than the forced protection policies. This economic pressure was the true catalyst for the violence against Penhaligon. The opposition was losing revenue, and their control over the waterfront was slipping. Every client who switched to Vance's provider was not just a business victory, but a provocation that increased the likelihood of the opposition making a mistake. Vance was monetizing their frustration, baiting them into acts of desperation that would eventually serve as the nails in their coffins. This economic warfare was invisible to the casual observer, but it was felt acutely by Salvatore Moretti and his lieutenants. They viewed the loss of income as a challenge to their authority, an erosion of the tribute they believed they were owed. Vance, however, saw it as a stress test, a way to force the organization to reveal its inner workings under pressure. When they resorted to violence to maintain their market share, they exposed the coercive nature of their business model, providing Vance with the exact documentation he needed. He was not just competing with them, he was auditing them, using their own brutality as the ink for his ledger. The transition from reactive to proactive strategy was sealed when Vance decided to formally approach the federal government. This was a step that crossed a line in the underworld code, a move that could have branded him an informant and jeopardized his standing. Yet, Vance approached it not as a plea for help, but as a business proposition. He had a commodity that the FBI desperately wanted: detailed, actionable intelligence on a major crime family. And he was willing to trade it for the time and space necessary to let the trap spring fully. The meeting that would eventually take place in a Queens parking garage was merely the formalization of a partnership that had been building in the shadows for months. The mental architecture of this plan was a marvel of strategic foresight. Vance had to hold two contradictory realities in his mind simultaneously: the immediate reality of danger and disrespect, and the long-term reality of victory through the courts. He had to endure the slights of the present to secure the triumph of the future. This dual vision required a discipline that bordered on the monastic. He could not afford the luxury of anger, nor the distraction of ego. Every decision, every conversation, every move he made was filtered through the singular question of whether it would add weight to the case he was building. While the specific assault on Penhaligon was a critical piece of evidence, it was the deeper history of the conflict that gave the case its true momentum. To understand why Vance was so prepared to capitalize on the violence, one had to look back to the origins of his attempt to breach the waterfront. The hostility had not begun with the staple gun. It had begun months earlier, with a public humiliation designed to put a Harlem operator in his place. The seeds of the trap were sown the moment Vance first drove his Cadillac onto the cobblestones of the Red Hook container terminal, an intrusion that the established power structure was determined to punish. The confrontation that set the entire sequence in motion occurred on a crisp afternoon in October of 1961, under the shadow of the gantry cranes that loomed over the Brooklyn skyline like skeletal giants. Vance had arrived with a contract in his briefcase and a belief that legitimate business could coexist with the established order. He was about to learn that, on the docks, legitimacy was viewed as a Trojan horse, a threat to be repelled with prejudice. The laughter that greeted him that day would echo in his mind for years, a constant reminder that his enemies were building their own downfall, one insult at a time. The Red Hook container terminal on a Tuesday in October of 1961 operated with the chaotic rhythm of a living organism, where cargo containers stacked 3 stories high blocked the autumn sun, and longshoremen moved with the weary precision of men who knew the price of a missed step. It was here, amidst the roar of diesel engines and the clatter of winches, that Ellsworth Doc Vance attempted to bridge the divide between Harlem's financial ambition and Brooklyn's insular industrial control. He arrived in a black Cadillac sedan, a vehicle whose polished chrome and pristine finish stood out against the backdrop of rust and grease like a jewel in a coal mine. In his hand was a leather briefcase containing not a weapon, but a proposal for shipping insurance that undercut the local syndicate's rates by a significant margin, offering a legitimate alternative to the coerced protection that had bled the independent operators dry for decades. Salvatore Moretti, known on the street as Sal the Butcher, stood near the entrance to Warehouse 4, flanked by 2 men whose suits bulged in unnatural places. Moretti was a man who carried his authority in his posture, a heavy-set figure with a face that had weatherized under the salt air of the waterfront. He watched the Cadillac approach with the expression of a landlord spotting a rodent in a clean kitchen. Not fear, but a dull, annoyed recognition that a cleanup was required. When Vance stepped out, adjusting his cuffs and smoothing the lapel of a charcoal coat tailored on 7th Avenue, the contrast between the 2 men could not have been starker. Vance was the picture of uptown sophistication, while Moretti represented the raw, unpolished power of the docks. The atmosphere shifted the moment Vance's shoes touched the pavement. Conversations among the dock workers died down, and eyes shifted toward the unfolding standoff. Vance walked toward Moretti with a steady, unhurried gait, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side. He did not approach as a supplicant or a rival, but as a businessman calling on a client. However, the protocols of the waterfront were different from the parlors of Harlem. When he was 10 feet away, Moretti raised a hand, palm out, a gesture of stoppage that carried the weight of an absolute decree. He did not speak immediately. He simply let the silence stretch, forcing Vance to halt in the shadow of a forklift. "You're lost, boy," Moretti finally said, his voice carrying the gravel of 1,000 cigarettes. The words were not shouted, but they possessed a projection that ensured every nearby longshoreman could hear. "This isn't the train to Harlem. You're about 20 blocks too far south." The insult was delivered with a casual cruelty, a public drawing of a boundary line that Vance was expected to acknowledge. The men flanking Moretti chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that served as an auditory warning system. They were not laughing because it was funny. They were laughing to demonstrate that they agreed with the premise that Vance did not belong. Vance stopped, his face betraying none of the irritation that a lesser man might have shown. He stood in the crisp afternoon light, the wind whipping the hem of his coat, and regarded Moretti with a steady, analytical gaze. He did not argue, nor did he display the anger that the provocation was designed to elicit. Instead, he offered a simple statement of fact. "I have a proposal for the independent shippers," Vance said, his voice calm and level. "It saves them money. Legitimate business. I was told this was a free port." The phrase "free port" hung in the air, a challenge to the very notion of the controlled territory that Moretti oversaw. The response was immediate and physical, though not in the way of a strike or a shove. Moretti stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he was standing uncomfortably close, invading Vance's personal space. He looked the Harlem strategist up and down, his lip curling into a sneer of dismissal. "Free for us," Moretti corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Not for you. You take your fancy car and your fancy suit, and you drive back uptown. You don't have the juice to operate here. Never will. This isn't a game for errand boys." The deliberate degradation of Vance's status was calculated to humiliate, to force him to retreat with his tail between his legs. The tension on the dock ramped up, a palpable pressure in the air. The dock workers, many of whom relied on the waterfront for their daily bread, watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. They knew that challenges to Moretti's authority were rare and usually ended badly for the challenger. Vance's silence in the face of such open disrespect was noted. Some interpreted it as fear, a sign that the man from Harlem had been cowed by the show of force. But those who looked closer might have seen the way Vance's eyes tracked the scene, noting the positions of the bodyguards, the faces of the witnesses, and the specific cadence of the insults being hurled his way. Vance slowly exhaled, a measured release of breath that seemed to reset the tension in his own body. He did not plead his case further, recognizing that the audience before him was not interested in logic or profit margins. The rules of this engagement were about power, and for the moment, Moretti held the lever. "I'll leave," Vance said quietly, his tone devoid of the subservience Moretti sought. "But this isn't finished. Business will find a way." It was a statement that sounded like a retreat, but carried the undertone of a promise. He turned on his heel, his movements deliberate and controlled, and walked back toward the Cadillac without looking back. As Vance drove away, the laughter erupted behind him, a chorus of mockery that followed his car down the long exit road. Moretti and his men enjoyed their victory, secure in the belief that they had repelled an invader with the simple application of dominance. They had no way of knowing that the man they had just dismissed as an errand boy had filed the encounter away in his mental ledger. The public humiliation was a tangible asset for Vance, a clear demonstration of the monopoly and the intent to exclude that would later form the basis of a federal inquiry. Every word spoken, every gesture of dismissal was already being transcribed in his memory. The incident at the container terminal was the spark, but the fire required fuel. Vance had confirmed what he suspected. The opposition would not compete on merit. They would rely on intimidation to maintain their stranglehold. This validation was crucial, for it told him exactly how to proceed. He did not need to outfight them. He needed to let them operate until their operations crossed the line into prosecutable offenses. The game had changed from a business dispute to a waiting game, a test of endurance that Vance was uniquely qualified to win. The first move had been theirs. The next move would be his, played on a board they did not even realize existed. The dismissal at the waterfront was only the opening salvo in a campaign of psychological warfare. Moretti, having tasted success in his public humiliation of Vance, was not content to let the matter rest with a single confrontation. The lesson he wished to impart required a broader audience, a setting where the hierarchy of power could be displayed for all to see. The Union Hall in Cobble Hill, a brick fortress of labor politics and social gathering, would become the stage for the second act of this drama. It was there that the conflict would escalate from verbal insults to a physical violation of personal space, pushing the boundaries of Vance's endurance to their absolute limit. The Longshoremen's Union Hall on Clinton Street in Cobble Hill stood as a citadel of labor power, its heavy wooden doors and frosted windows designed to keep the outside world at bay. Inside, the air was thick with the blue haze of cigarette smoke and the bitter aroma of stale coffee, an atmosphere that had remained unchanged for decades. It was here, 3 weeks after the incident at the container terminal, that Ellsworth Vance sought to bypass the street-level intimidation and appeal directly to the workers through their leadership. He entered the hall carrying the same leather briefcase, his presence drawing immediate attention from the 40-odd men gathered for the weekly union meeting. To them, Vance was an anomaly, a figure from a different world, stepping into their sanctuary with an assurance that suggested he belonged there. Salvatore Moretti was already present, seated at a table near the front, positioned like a judge in a courtroom. His arrival had been anticipated by his enforcers, who had secured the best seats and cleared a path for their boss. When Vance walked past the threshold, heading toward the office of the hall steward to discuss the insurance proposal, Moretti did not call out. Instead, he stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the room, silencing the conversations and causing heads to turn. It was a manufactured moment, a disruption designed to reclaim the center of attention. "Look who decided to visit," Moretti announced, his voice booming in the sudden quiet. He did not stay by his table, but began to walk toward the aisle where Vance had paused. The movement was predatory, a slow approach designed to maximize the discomfort of the target. The dock workers, men who understood the hierarchies of the waterfront implicitly, stepped back to clear a ring, effectively isolating Vance in the center of the floor. They were not just bystanders, they were the audience for a performance intended to reinforce the social order. Vance stopped his progress toward the office and turned to face the approaching threat, his hands loose at his sides. When Moretti reached Vance, he did something that violated the unspoken code of physical distance. He reached out and placed his hand heavily on Vance's shoulder. It was not a blow, but it was an act of possession, a touch meant to belittle and diminish. The hand lingered there, a weight that signaled to the room that the man from Harlem was small enough to be handled physically without consequence. "I told you the docks are closed," Moretti said, his tone intimate, but carrying enough volume to reach the back of the room. "But maybe you didn't hear me. Maybe you need a map. Uptown is that way." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, a nervous, compelled sound. Some men laughed because they feared Moretti, others because they genuinely enjoyed the spectacle of an interloper being dressed down. Vance stood perfectly still under the grip, his eyes locked on Moretti's face. He did not shrug the hand off, nor did he flinch. He endured the contact, his silence a stark contrast to the noise around him. Witnesses later recalled that Vance's expression was one of intense focus, as if he were memorizing the exact pressure of the fingers on his shoulder, recording the temperature of the room for future reference. "You're right, Sal," Vance said finally, his voice pitched low, intended only for the men closest to him. "This is your house. I respect that." The words were an admission of defeat, but the delivery lacked the necessary subservience. It was a tactical withdrawal, spoken with a calm that irritated Moretti further. The boss tightened his grip on Vance's shoulder for a fraction of a second before releasing it with a dismissive pat, the kind one might give a dog after a trick. "Go on then," Moretti commanded, stepping back. "Get in your car and forget the way back. Next time, we don't talk." Vance turned and walked out of the Union Hall, his stride unbroken, his posture upright. The laughter followed him out the door, a wave of mockery that broke against his back. Yet, inside his mind, the scene was being filed away with the precision of a court stenographer. The public nature of the humiliation was a gift. Moretti had performed his dominance in front of 40 witnesses, providing Vance with a roster of names and faces to correlate with the ongoing pattern of harassment. The assault on dignity was a misdemeanor in the eyes of the street, but in the architecture of Vance's federal case, it was a cornerstone. The exit from the hall marked a deepening of the stakes. The conflict was no longer about insurance rates or profit margins. It had become personal, a collision of pride and power. Moretti believed he had successfully defended his territory, but he had actually walked into a trap that Vance had laid by simply showing up. By tolerating the physical disrespect without retaliation, Vance had signaled a weakness that was actually a strength. The discipline to wait. The line had been crossed from business negotiation to personal violation, and the ledger in Vance's mind grew heavier with every step he took toward his car. For the men watching from the windows of the hall, Vance's departure was the end of the encounter. They saw a man retreating, a challenger routed by the entrenched authority of the waterfront. What they could not see was the invisible infrastructure being erected around them. Vance was mapping the social network of the docks, identifying who laughed the loudest, who looked away, and who held the real power. This intelligence was far more valuable than any insurance contract, for it provided the context necessary to understand the flow of money and violence that sustained Moretti's operation. The Union Hall incident was not a defeat. It was a reconnaissance mission. The calculated nature of Vance's response, or lack thereof, suggested a deeper strategy at work. While the street code demanded immediate retribution for such a slight, Vance operated by a different clock. He understood that the accumulation of grievances was the fuel for a federal prosecution, and Moretti was generously providing that fuel. The incident at the Union Hall would serve as a critical link in the chain, demonstrating the continuity of the harassment and the environment of fear that the organization maintained. It was a piece of the puzzle that would eventually fit into the larger picture of a criminal enterprise violating the rights of citizens to conduct legal commerce. However, Vance knew that words and gestures, no matter how humiliating, were often insufficient to trigger a federal investigation of the magnitude he envisioned. The Bureau required more than hurt feelings or bruised egos. It needed blood on the floor and documented acts of violence. The conflict was escalating on a trajectory that would inevitably lead to more than just a heavy hand on a shoulder. The next logical step in the opposition's playbook was severe physical coercion, a demonstration of force that would terrify the community into compliance. It was this dark inevitability that Vance was preparing for, knowing that the next victim might not be as patient or as strategically inclined as he was. To understand how Ellsworth Vance managed to construct an airtight legal framework against a criminal organization that operated in the shadows, one must look backward, beyond the confrontations at the Union Hall and the container terminal. The foundation of his case was laid in the late autumn of 1958, not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but on the fraying concrete of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was there that Vance identified a structural weakness in his opponent's armor: the sheer number of low-level operatives who were forced to witness high-level crimes. Among these peripheral figures was a young dock worker named Thomas Bellini, a 19-year-old whose introduction to the waterfront had been arranged by an uncle with connections and a father with gambling debts. Bellini was the archetype of the invisible laborer, a man whose primary survival skill was the ability to blend into the background. He loaded crates, signed manifests without reading them, and kept his eyes fixed on the ground when the bosses walked past. To Salvatore Moretti and his lieutenants, Bellini was merely another pair of hands, indistinguishable from the hundreds of other men who toiled on the docks. They viewed his apparent nervousness as a symptom of weakness, a lack of the stomach required for the real work of the waterfront. This dismissal of Bellini's intellect and agency was a critical error in judgment, one that Vance was uniquely positioned to exploit. The encounter that would eventually shift the balance of power occurred on a grey, wind-swept afternoon near the derelict supply depots on the eastern edge of the yard. Bellini was taking a solitary break behind a stack of pallets, attempting to steady his nerves after a shift spent handling cargo he knew was illicit. Vance approached him without ceremony, stepping out of the shadows as if he had materialized from the very concrete. The older man did not threaten or intimidate. He simply stated a number. A figure representing the exact amount of the debt that Bellini's father owed to a bookmaker in the Bronx. It was a precise sum, calculated down to the dollar, and hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger froze the young dock worker in place. Vance offered a trade that was as transactional as it was inescapable. He produced an envelope containing the full amount of the debt, cash that would prevent the breaking of legs or the destruction of the family home. In return, Bellini was to perform a task that required no violence, only observation. He was to keep a journal, a simple, hidden record of the shipments that passed through his hands. Not the legitimate cargo, but the crates marked agricultural equipment that were unloaded in the dead of night, the trucks with out-of-state plates that bypassed the way stations, and the inspectors who looked the other way. The fear of retaliation for informing was high, but the fear of Vance's knowledge was higher. Bellini realized that this man from Harlem knew more about his life than his own mother did, and that refusal was not a safe option. The transaction was sealed without a handshake. Bellini took the envelope, and Vance walked away, leaving the young man with a new, dangerous purpose. From that day forward, the dock worker became a conduit of intelligence, a human wiretap embedded in the heart of the operation. He was not a soldier in a war, but a sensor in a surveillance network, gathering the raw data that Vance needed to build his case. For 3 years, this arrangement continued in absolute secrecy. Bellini carried a small spiral-bound notebook in the inner pocket of his work jacket, scribbling dates, times, and license plate numbers during his breaks. He recorded the names of the drivers, the descriptions of the cargo, and the specific docks where the transfers occurred. The information was mundane on its own, a collection of seemingly random details that meant little to the casual observer. But in the aggregate, it painted a picture of a sophisticated smuggling pipeline that moved stolen military hardware through the port of New York with impunity. The method of retrieval was designed to minimize risk for both the informant and the handler. Every 2 weeks, a woman named Sarah, who worked as a secretary in a nearby shipping office, would cross paths with Bellini in a crowded cafeteria or a busy newsstand. There was no conversation, only a momentary brush of hands that exchanged the full notebook for a fresh one. The used journal would then be spirited uptown to Vance's office, where its contents were analyzed, cross-referenced, and filed. This sterile, professional process ensured that Bellini never had to step foot in Harlem, and Vance never had to return to the docks. By early 1961, the volume of intelligence gathered was staggering. Vance had assembled a chronological map of the waterfront's illegal activities, supported by physical evidence that corroborated Bellini's handwritten notes. The journal entries were supplemented by copies of falsified customs documents, photographs taken from a distance of clandestine meetups, and bank records that showed deposits corresponding to the dates of the shipments. It was a dossier of a scope that federal prosecutors rarely saw, detailing the anatomy of a criminal enterprise from the ground up. The significance of this deep cover intelligence gathering cannot be overstated. While Moretti focused on protecting his territory from rival gangs and collecting his tribute, he was unaware that the most dangerous threat to his freedom was a quiet kid he had dismissed as a coward. The arrogance of the waterfront bosses blinded them to the possibility that a man from Harlem could infiltrate their ranks using patience instead of force. They were prepared for bullets and bombs, but they had no defense against ledgers and logs. Bellini's journal was the silent countdown, ticking beneath the noise of their daily operations. This vast reservoir of evidence provided Vance with the leverage he needed to approach the federal authorities, but the mechanics of that approach required a specific venue and a specific mindset. He possessed the ammunition, but he needed a weapon capable of firing it. The police were compromised, and the state authorities were politically entangled. There was only one entity with the jurisdiction and the motivation to act on the intelligence Vance had gathered: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The next phase of the operation required stepping out of the shadows of the underworld and into the harsh fluorescent light of the law. The meeting that would alter the trajectory of the waterfront conflict took place in the early hours of a damp November morning in 1961, deep within the concrete bowels of a municipal parking garage in Jamaica, Queens. The location was chosen for its anonymity, a place where a black Cadillac sedan and a government-issue Ford could sit side by side without drawing the attention of passers-by. Ellsworth Vance sat in his vehicle, the engine off, the windows cracked just enough to allow the damp air to circulate. He was waiting for a man whose career had stalled, a federal agent named Michael O'Connor, who had spent 3 years chasing ghosts on the docks without making a single substantial arrest. Agent O'Connor arrived precisely on time, his suspicion evident in the way he kept his hand near his holster as he approached the Cadillac. He was a man worn down by bureaucratic inertia and the realization that the local police force was actively working against his investigations. When Vance stepped out of his car into the fluorescent glare of the garage, the contrast between the two men was stark. Vance, the composed strategist in a tailored topcoat, and O'Connor, the rumpled G-man with bags under his eyes and a desperate need for a win. There were no pleasantries exchanged, no handshake to cement the encounter, only a mutual recognition that the enemy of their enemy was a necessary friend. Vance did not bargain. He simply opened his briefcase on the hood of his car and presented O'Connor with a thick file containing the fruits of Thomas Bellini's labor and the documentation surrounding the assault on Arthur Penhaligon. The agent's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. Dates, names, license plate numbers, and photographs that laid bare the operations of Salvatore Moretti's organization with a clarity that police intelligence had never achieved. It was a prosecutor's dream, a roadmap to a RICO indictment that had been assembled not by the FBI, but by the very man the Bureau usually kept under surveillance. "You have enough here for warrants," Vance stated, his voice echoing slightly in the empty structure. "But not enough to bury them forever. If you move now, you get a few lieutenants. The boss walks away. The infrastructure stays." O'Connor, though stunned by the quality of the intelligence, was a veteran of the system. He knew that a hasty arrest based on evidence from an unvetted source could crumble in court, especially against the high-priced defense attorneys that Moretti could afford. The agent demanded to know the source, but Vance remained steadfast, refusing to compromise Bellini or his methods. The only assurance he offered was that the information was accurate and ongoing. The negotiation that followed was not about money or immunity, but about time. Vance proposed a pact of patience, a delay of 30 months to allow the operation to ripen fully. He argued that Moretti was growing arrogant, making mistakes in public that would provide the necessary witness testimony and corroborative evidence to ensure a conviction with a mandatory minimum sentence. "Let them operate," Vance urged. "Every shipment they move, every threat they make, adds another bar to the cage. I need you to wait until the door is ready to close." For a federal agent under pressure to produce results, the idea of waiting was counterintuitive, yet the sheer weight of the potential charges was too tempting to ignore. O'Connor struggled with the moral and professional implications of partnering with a known figure from the Harlem underworld. It crossed lines that the Bureau had long held sacred. Yet, the reality of the waterfront was that traditional methods had failed. The code of silence was impenetrable from the outside. Only someone inside the ecosystem could dismantle it. Vance was offering himself as the fulcrum upon which the entire case would turn. The agent looked at the file again, realizing that this was likely his only chance to take down a major player in the organized crime hierarchy. "The Bureau doesn't negotiate with criminals," O'Connor said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. Vance corrected him with a soft intensity. "This isn't negotiation, Agent. It's a tactical alignment. I want them stopped. You want them jailed. Our interests align for exactly 30 months. He then made a crucial stipulation. The FBI would not move on the organization until Vance gave the signal. He needed to control the timing of the final act to ensure that when the trap snapped shut, it caught everyone of consequence. There could be no half measures, no plea bargains that let the leadership escape. The agreement was sealed with a nod, a silent pact that existed outside the bounds of official protocol. O'Connor would take the initial file to his superiors, using it to justify keeping the investigation open and allocating resources for surveillance that would parallel Vance's own efforts. He would provide the official authority. Vance would provide the street-level intelligence and the strategic timing. It was a dangerous gambit that put a civilian in command of a federal operation, but the potential payoff, a complete dismantling of the waterfront racket, was worth the risk. The agent walked back to his car, carrying the weight of the conspiracy in the file under his arm. As the Ford's tail lights disappeared into the darkness of the garage exit, Vance remained behind for a moment, processing the new reality. He had just recruited the United States government as his enforcement arm. The dynamic of the conflict had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer a turf war between rival factions, but a slow-motion prosecution. The streets would remain quiet, the violence would continue sporadically, but every incident was now feeding into a machine that would eventually consume the men responsible. The cage he had spoken of was no longer a metaphor. It was being welded together by federal statute and evidence law. This alliance provided the structural integrity Vance needed for the final phase of his plan. With the FBI standing by, the urgency to react to every insult or provocation evaporated. He could afford to be patient, to absorb the mockery and the intimidation, because he knew the ultimate outcome was assured. The waiting game had transformed from a test of endurance into a scheduled execution. The date of the trial was already written in the future, even if the defendants did not yet know it. The silence from Harlem would continue, feeding the opposition's false sense of security. While Vance and O'Connor solidified their partnership in the shadows, Salvatore Moretti and his associates remained oblivious to the shifting tides. They interpreted the lack of retaliation for the Union Hall incident as confirmation of their dominance. Their arrogance, however, was beginning to manifest in ways that extended beyond simple turf disputes. Frustrated by the slow erosion of their insurance revenue, they began to discuss the problem in terms that required a permanent solution. The conversation was moving from intimidation to elimination, a dangerous escalation that Vance had anticipated, but one that would carry immense risks for everyone involved. The stakes were about to be raised from reputation to survival. The internal pressure within Salvatore Moretti's organization reached a critical mass in the early weeks of January 1962. Financial reports delivered to the back table of a private supper club in Carroll Gardens revealed a disturbing trend. Revenue from the waterfront protection rackets had declined by nearly 40% over the previous fiscal year. The independent operators, emboldened by the quiet persistence of Ellsworth Vance's insurance initiative, were slowly drifting away from the mandated coverage. Moretti sat amidst the rising smoke of expensive cigars and the clinking of glasses, his mood darkening as the numbers were read aloud. To a man who had built his empire on the absolute certainty of tribute, this erosion was not merely a business loss, it was a personal insult that demanded a decisive response. Moretti's lieutenants, men like the brutish Carmine and the more calculating Pauly, exchanged nervous glances as they voiced their concerns. They spoke of Vance's persistence, noting that the Harlem strategist continued to sign clients despite the public humiliations and the physical warnings. The conversation turned to the possibility that their rival was not operating alone, perhaps bribing judges or politicians to secure his foothold. Moretti dismissed these theories with a wave of his hand, his contempt for Vance blinding him to the strategic depth of the threat. He refused to believe that a man he considered an errand boy could outmaneuver the established order without resorting to the same corrupt tactics they employed. "You give him too much credit," Moretti declared, his voice slicing through the murmurs of the room. He framed Vance's survival not as competence, but as a failure of enforcement on their part. To Moretti, the solution was simple and violent. The problem was not the business model, but the man himself. If Vance was removed from the equation, the Harlem operation would collapse, and the waterfront would return to its natural state of submission. It was a decision born of arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy he faced. He was preparing to play a game of brute force against an opponent who had already moved the board into a federal courtroom. The belief in their own invincibility was a collective delusion that permeated the room. They saw the silence from Harlem as weakness, interpreting the lack of gunfire or counter-intimidation as a sign that Vance was retreating. They could not conceive of a strategy that relied on the legal system, a world they had long since neutralized through bribery and fear. In their minds, power was measured solely by the number of guns one could deploy and the brutality of the message one could send. They were fighting a 20th century gang war, while Vance was prosecuting a 20th century legal battle, and the asymmetry of their approaches would prove fatal to the old order. As the meeting progressed, the rhetoric escalated from frustration to conspiracy. Moretti outlined a plan to end the conflict permanently, a departure from the previous tactics of intimidation. He no longer wanted to scare Vance away. He wanted to erase him. "We have been too polite," Moretti announced to his gathered crew. "We treated him like a guest who overstayed his welcome. It is time to treat him like a disease that needs to be cut out." The order was implicit, but understood by every man present. The next interaction with Ellsworth Vance would not be a negotiation or a beating. It would be an execution. This decision marked the point of no return for the organization. In choosing lethal force, they were walking directly into the trap that Vance and Agent O'Connor had laid. A murder charge, particularly one involving a figure of Vance's stature, would bring a level of scrutiny that no amount of local corruption could deflect. Federal authorities could overlook extortion and gambling, but a high-profile assassination was a different matter entirely. By escalating to murder, Moretti was providing the final piece of evidence needed to justify the ultimate federal intervention. He was signing his own arrest warrant. The logistics of the assassination were discussed with a chilling casualness. They debated locations, the docks, a Harlem jazz club, or a quiet street corner, before settling on the idea of a final meeting. Moretti wanted to look Vance in the eye before the end, to see the realization that his defiance had cost him everything. This desire for a theatrical conclusion, a need to dominate the narrative until the very last second, would serve as the mechanism for their downfall. It was decided that a formal invitation would be extended, calling for a sit-down to discuss terms, a ruse designed to lure the target into a controlled environment where escape was impossible. The hubris of the organization was documented not in minutes, but in the terrified memories of the wait staff who moved silently around the table, refilling glasses and clearing ashtrays. These invisible witnesses noted the shift in tone, the way the men leaned in closer, their voices dropping to whispers that carried the weight of death. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the anticipation of violence, a sensation that had become all too familiar in the turbulent history of the waterfront. The men in that room believed they were the predators, unaware that they were being watched by a much larger, more powerful predator from above. Word of the contract being discussed filtered out through the intricate web of informants and hangers on that surrounded the Brooklyn underworld. It was a whisper that traveled through the ranks, a rumor of a big move against Harlem. When this intelligence reached the ears of Vance's network, it was treated with the utmost gravity. The abstract strategy of the 3-year plan was about to collide with the immediate reality of a bullet. The timeline that Vance had so carefully managed was now being accelerated by the desperate actions of a cornered animal. The transition from planning to action was swift. The decision to send a formal invitation to Vance, summoning him to a neutral ground in Little Italy, was the final error in judgment. It created a scheduled event, a fixed point in time and space that could be manipulated. Vance would not be ambushed in a dark alley, where the evidence would be circumstantial and the witnesses non-existent. Instead, he would be walking into a prepared room, surrounded by his enemies, carrying a wire, and backed by the full force of the FBI. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the waterfront for generations. The countdown began with the drafting of a single envelope. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant, a stark contrast to the violent intent contained within the message. The invitation was not just a trap for Ellsworth Vance. It was the closing mechanism of the cage he had spent 3 years constructing. As the messenger was dispatched uptown, the organization celebrated what they believed to be their imminent victory, unaware that they were merely pawns in a much larger game. The end game had begun, and the silence of the strategist was about to be broken by the sound of a closing door. The catalyst for the final confrontation arrived at the Renaissance Ballroom on 7th Avenue, just after midnight on the 10th of April, 1962. A young courier, dressed in a suit that cost more than a month's rent, stepped through the heavy doors with the confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. He bypassed the patrons and the jazz drifting from the speakers, heading straight for the bar where Julius Big Earl Carter was overseeing the night's receipts. Without a word, he slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the polished wood, the handwritten name Ellsworth Vance, visible in elegant script. The messenger departed as silently as he had arrived, leaving behind an object that radiated menace. Vance arrived 20 minutes later, his Cadillac cutting through the Harlem night. He accepted the envelope from Carter with a steady hand, examining the quality of the paper and the precise angle of the handwriting. It was a document designed to intimidate, a piece of theater intended to signal the end of negotiations. Inside, the message was brief and chilling. An address in Little Italy, a time set for 2:30 in the afternoon on the 12th of April, and a single line warning that his presence was required alone. The implication was clear. This was not an invitation to a sit-down, but a summons to an execution. The atmosphere in the back office of the ballroom grew heavy as Vance read the contents aloud to his inner circle. Carter, along with the strategist Raymond Clayton and the enforcer Willie Gaines, stood in a tight knot, their faces illuminated by the single desk lamp. The immediate reaction was one of protective aggression. Carter argued that the meeting was a death trap, a fatal mission that no leader should be expected to walk into. Gaines suggested a preemptive strike, arguing that a well-placed bomb under Moretti's car would solve the problem more efficiently than any meeting ever could. Raymond Clayton, however, saw the deeper strategic currents at play. He countered the calls for violence with a cold analysis of the consequences. A war with the Brooklyn faction would bring down a level of heat that Harlem could not withstand. If Vance struck first, he would become the aggressor in the eyes of the law, and the carefully constructed image of a legitimate businessman would shatter. The opposition wanted a war. They wanted Vance to react with emotion. To deny them that reaction was the first step in seizing control of the narrative. The room fell silent as the strategist laid out the cost of a street war versus the potential value of a walk into the lion's den. Vance listened to his lieutenant's debate, his own mind racing through the calculus of the coming days. He saw what they could not. The invitation was the final piece of the puzzle he had been constructing for 3 years. It placed every key member of the opposition in a single, contained location at a specific time. It provided the opportunity for the pattern of behavior that Agent O'Connor needed to move from surveillance to arrest. By walking into the trap alone, Vance was not surrendering. He was baiting the hook with his own life, trusting that the FBI would be there to reel in the catch. "I will go alone," Vance announced, his voice cutting through the argument. The declaration stunned the room. He explained the arrangement with O'Connor, revealing the depth of his partnership with the federal government for the first time. He detailed the wire he would wear, the agents stationed nearby, and the guarantee of a federal raid the moment the opposition made a move against him. It was a revelation that redefined the nature of the conflict for his men. They were not sending their leader to die. They were sending him to close the trap. The logistics of the operation were reviewed with military precision. Vance would wear a recording device taped to his chest, a small piece of technology that represented his only lifeline. The FBI team would be staged in unmarked vehicles around the block, listening in real time. A specific code word was established, a signal that would trigger an immediate breach if the situation deteriorated before the scheduled time. The margin for error was non-existent. A delay of even a few seconds could result in Vance's death and the collapse of the entire case. There was, however, a grim contingency plan that had to be addressed. Vance looked at his 3 trusted men and gave them a direct order that contradicted every code of the street. If the FBI failed, if the wire went dead, or if the trap snapped too early, they were not to seek revenge. They were to take the evidence already gathered, the files, the journals, the witness statements, and hand them over to the federal prosecutors. There would be no cycle of blood retribution. The goal was not vengeance, but the complete legal decimation of the enemy. It was a difficult edict for men of action to accept, but they nodded in agreement, bound by their loyalty to the strategist. As the meeting adjourned in the early hours of the morning, a heavy stillness settled over Harlem. Word of the envelope and the deadline spread through the community like a cold wind. The usual vibrancy of the neighborhood seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Barber shops opened with quiet discussions. Corner stores operated with nervous efficiency. Everyone understood that the next 48 hours would determine the future of the waterfront and the balance of power in the city. There would be no peace until the deadline passed. Vance spent the remainder of the night in solitude, preparing not for a battle of bullets, but for a performance of calm. He laid out his clothes, a grey suit that projected authority and respect, and reviewed the contents of his briefcase. He was not packing a weapon, but the accumulated weight of 3 years of documentation. The execution he was walking toward was not his own, but that of Salvatore Moretti's empire. The invitation in his pocket was not a death sentence. It was the RSVP to his enemy's final curtain call. The mechanism of their destruction was now in motion, ticking down with the inevitability of a clock. The 12th of April, 1962, dawned under a grey, featureless sky that seemed to press down upon the city. Ellsworth Vance began the day with a ritual of absolute normalcy, consuming a breakfast of eggs and black coffee in his apartment above the grocery store on Lenox Avenue. He dressed with meticulous care, selecting the charcoal suit that had been tailored to fit his frame perfectly, a garment that projected an image of unshakable composure. The wire, a small device capable of capturing every whispered threat, was taped securely to his chest. He checked the connection once, hearing the faint crackle in the earpiece, before buttoning his shirt and donning his coat. At precisely 1:45 in the afternoon, the telephone on his desk rang, the sound shrill in the quiet room. It was Agent Michael O'Connor on the secured line, confirming the final coordinates of the operation. The federal team was already in motion, positioning themselves in unmarked sedans along the cross streets of Little Italy, just out of sight of the target location. O'Connor's voice was tight with professional tension as he reviewed the protocols one last time. He reminded Vance that the moment the situation turned violent, the breach would be immediate, driven by the sound of the confrontation transmitted through the wire. Vance departed Harlem in his Cadillac, driving south through the sprawling urban landscape toward the inevitable confrontation. The city streets were busy with the afternoon rush, but inside the car, the silence was profound. He reviewed the contents of his briefcase one last time. The thick dossier of evidence, the copies of Thomas Bellini's journals, and the photographs of the waterfront operations. This was the ammunition he would use to shatter the illusion of his enemy's invincibility. He was not driving to a meeting. He was driving to the closing arguments of a trial that had been 3 years in the making. Café Palermo was a squat, brick building on a narrow side street, its windows papered over to obscure the interior from prying eyes. Vance parked the car, but left the engine running, a signal to any observers that he did not intend to stay long, though he knew he would not be driving the vehicle back. He stepped out onto the pavement, the weight of the briefcase in his right hand grounding him in the moment. He adjusted his coat, straightened his hat, and walked toward the front door, with the steady, rhythmic gait of a man who had already won. The door was locked, the blinds drawn, creating the sensation of approaching a vault rather than a restaurant. He knocked twice, a solid, heavy sound. Inside, he could hear the shuffle of feet, the distinct metallic click of a shotgun being racked. A moment later, the lock turned, and the door swung open to reveal the tense face of a young enforcer. Vance stepped across the threshold into the dim interior, the door sealing shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence of the room. The interior of the cafe was hazy with smoke, the air stale and thick. Arranged around the room were 7 of Moretti's men, their postures rigid, their hands resting on weapons that ranged from revolvers to a sawed-off shotgun. At the center of this armed constellation sat Salvatore Moretti himself, a glass of drink before him, a cigarette burning in the ashtray. When he saw Vance standing there, alone and unarmed in the physical sense, Moretti's face broke into a wide, incredulous smile. The laughter began low in his chest, building until it filled the room, a sound of pure, unfiltered contempt. "You actually came," Moretti said, his voice thick with amusement. "I half expected you to be on a train to Jersey by now. Sit down, Vance. Let's discuss how you're going to fix the mess you've made on my docks." The lieutenants around the room chuckled, a chorus of sycophantic agreement. They saw a man who had walked into a trap, a victim who had delivered himself to his executioners. They did not see the microphone beneath the shirt, nor did they sense the federal agents listening to every word from less than a block away. Vance moved to the empty chair opposite Moretti, but he did not sit immediately. Instead, he placed his briefcase on the table, the leather making a heavy thud that cut through the laughter. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each gunman in turn, his expression devoid of fear. "You wanted to talk, Salvatore," Vance said, his voice calm, but projecting with a force that demanded attention. "So let's talk, but not about insurance. Let's talk about the cargo manifests from November of '59. Let's talk about the payments to the customs officials." The smile on Moretti's face faltered, the confusion breaking through the arrogance. Vance reached into the briefcase, causing every hand in the room to twitch toward a weapon. Instead of a gun, he withdrew the thick stack of files and photographs, scattering them across the white tablecloth. The images were damning. Unloading operations, blacked-out license plates, and clear shots of the men in the room handling stolen military hardware. "You invited me here to kill me," Vance continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But I came to show you the federal indictment you've been writing for 3 years." Moretti's face drained of color as he looked at the evidence spread before him. He reached for the pistol at his waist, but his hand trembled. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him. He had been outmaneuvered not by force, but by patience. "You think this scares me?" Moretti stammered, though the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. "I can make a call, and you never leave this room." Vance simply tapped his chest right over the wire. "Make the call, Salvatore. But keep in mind that Agent O'Connor is listening live. You have about 10 seconds before this room becomes very crowded." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where the bravado had been. Then, the front door exploded inward, splinters of wood flying across the room as a battering ram did its work. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" The shout was accompanied by the heavy thud of boots on the floor as agents in windbreakers poured into the confined space, weapons drawn and leveled at the men around the table. The tableau of power that Moretti had constructed dissolved in an instant, replaced by the chaotic reality of a federal takedown. The enforcers dropped their weapons, the metal clattering against the tile floor. Moretti stood frozen, his hands half raised, the pistol still tucked in his waistband, but forgotten. Agent O'Connor entered the room, his eyes locking on to Vance, who remained standing calmly by the table, the only unarmed man in the room. As the agents moved to handcuff the suspects, Moretti looked at Vance with a mixture of hatred and bewilderment. "You set me up," he hissed. "You used yourself as bait." Vance adjusted his cuffs and looked down at the man who had once mocked him in public. "I used your arrogance as bait," he replied, "and you took it every time." The raid was swift and efficient, marking the end of the organization's stranglehold on the waterfront, and the beginning of a very long silence for Salvatore Moretti. The sentencing hearing for Salvatore Moretti took place in a federal courthouse in downtown Brooklyn, a stark, brutalist building that offered no warmth to the men standing before the bar of justice. The trial had been a swift and devastating affair, driven largely by the overwhelming weight of the evidence that Ellsworth Vance had spent 3 years compiling. Witness testimony from Thomas Bellini, corroborated by the financial records and the photographs recovered from the raid, painted a picture of a criminal enterprise so vast that the defense could only argue procedure, not innocence. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the room fell into a silence so deep it seemed to absorb the sound of the breath. Salvatore Moretti was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary, a term that effectively amounted to life for a man of his age and health. His lieutenants, the 7 men who had stood with him in Café Palermo, received sentences ranging from 15 to 22 years, accumulating to a total of over 150 years of prison time. The structure of the organization was not merely damaged, it was obliterated. The judge, a stern figure who had seen countless mob cases pass through his courtroom, made a specific note of the unprecedented cooperation between a civilian informant and the Federal Bureau, a dynamic that had allowed the prosecution to bypass the usual roadblocks of witness intimidation. For the waterfront, the conviction represented a seismic shift in the distribution of power. With the entrenched leadership removed, the stranglehold on the independent shipping companies dissolved almost overnight. Ellsworth Vance moved quickly to consolidate the legitimate insurance operations he had championed from the start. Rates dropped, and the protection money that had been siphoned from the docks for decades was replaced by honest premiums and actual coverage. The change was not merely economic, it was atmospheric. The pervasive climate of fear that had defined the Brooklyn piers for generations began to lift, replaced by the mundane, reliable rhythms of legal commerce. The impact on the Italian families in the region was profound. They had lost not just a revenue stream, but a significant piece of their political influence. The message sent by the conviction was clear and terrifying. The old rules of omerta and street justice were no longer sufficient protection against a man who knew how to weaponize the federal legal system. They withdrew their operations from Harlem and the waterfront entirely, unwilling to risk another encounter with a strategist who fought with subpoenas rather than pistols. The borders of the city were redrawn not in blood, but in the ink of legal briefs. While Vance solidified his control uptown, Salvatore Moretti began his descent into the federal prison system. He was processed at a high-security facility in Pennsylvania, stripped of his tailored suits and his entourage, reduced to a number on a clipboard. The man who had once controlled the ebb and flow of millions of dollars in illicit cargo now found himself arguing over commissary privileges and yard time. The transition from a waterfront boss to a federal inmate was a degradation that ate at his spirit more effectively than any cancer could. He had plenty of time to think, and his thoughts invariably circled back to the afternoon in Cafe Palermo. The legend of the confrontation began to circulate almost immediately, growing in the telling until it achieved a mythological status within both the underworld and law enforcement circles. The specific detail that resonated most was the duration of the event, 90 seconds. In that brief span, the entire hierarchy of the waterfront had been inverted. The laughter that had greeted Vance's entrance was cited as the ultimate symbol of hubris, a sound that had cost the men laughing their freedom. It became a cautionary tale told in social clubs and FBI briefing rooms alike, a story of how silence and patience could dismantle a kingdom built on noise and force. Moretti served 18 years of his sentence. The prison environment, combined with the weight of his defeat, took a heavy toll on his physical health. In the late spring of 1980, he was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer, a disease that had metastasized unchecked in the stale air of the prison hospital. He died alone in the infirmary ward at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday, with no family at his bedside and no flower arrangements adorning the room. The man who had once commanded an army of dock workers and enforcers passed from the world in anonymity, his legacy reduced to a case file in a federal archive. In the years following the takedown, the name of Ellsworth Vance became synonymous with a new brand of power in Harlem. He was no longer seen merely as a community leader or a businessman, but as a master architect of consequence. The saying that emerged from the episode, "When they mock you, remember it, then turn their laughter into evidence," became a guiding principle for a younger generation of operators who sought to navigate the complex intersection of street life and legitimate enterprise. Vance had demonstrated that intelligence, coupled with an iron will, was the ultimate weapon in a city often ruled by impulse. Vance himself did not live to see old age, succumbing to a heart attack in his home in 1968. He died as he had lived, surrounded by respect, his affairs in order, and his legacy secure. His funeral was a massive event, attended by the luminaries of Harlem society, local politicians, and quiet men in plain clothes who owed their livelihoods to his strategic vision. His gravestone, a simple granite marker in a Bronx cemetery, bore no elaborate epithet or gangster moniker. It read simply, "Strategist." The story of April 12, 1962, found its permanent home in the oral history of the city. It was a narrative that transcended the specifics of insurance rates or cargo manifests, settling into the realm of archetype. It spoke to the universal truth that power is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. The loud and the aggressive often command the room, but the quiet and the observant often own the building. Vance had proven that the most dangerous trap is the one the victim builds for himself, brick by brick, through his own assumptions. Historians and criminologists studying the era often cite the Moretti conviction as a pivotal moment in the decline of traditional organized crime in the port of New York. The case established a precedent for the use of long-term, civilian-led intelligence gathering, a precursor to the RICO statutes that would later dismantle families across the nation. The file that Vance handed to Agent O'Connor became a textbook example of how to prosecute corruption in industries traditionally controlled by silence. It was a victory won not in the streets, but in the meticulous recording of facts. In the end, the 90 seconds in Café Palermo served as a pivot point for history. Salvatore Moretti spent his final years in a cell, staring at a chessboard he could no longer win, finally understanding that he had been playing the wrong game all along. Ellsworth Vance had walked into the lion's den and walked out with the keys to the kingdom, proving that real power does not need to shout to be heard. It merely needs to wait, watch, and remember every single detail until the moment arrives to speak. The silence that Moretti had mistaken for weakness had been the sound of a cage being locked.